Good evening, viewers, and welcome to the Art with World. I am your host, Arshad Waheed. In our programs, we have been discussing various aspects of literary, performing, and visual arts like literature, dance, music, theatre, film, photography. And today, we are going to discuss a very interesting art form, which is architecture, which is very intimately linked with our day-to-day life, functionality of our life, aesthetics, and our cultural history. And for this discussion, we have a brilliant architect with us, Dr. Zahra Hussain. Dr. Zahra Hussain is currently engaged in different projects in northern areas, which deal with the challenges of infrastructural development and climate change. Welcome to our show.
Thank you very much.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Well, I was seeing your profile, and I just found out you had interest in various aspects of architecture, culture, human geography, climate change. I will discuss all these things, but first, if I could ask you your journey of learning architecture, your interest in architecture, and the work you did in this field.
Yes, thank you. So I have been trained as an architect from the National College of Arts in Lahore back in 2009. That's when I graduated. And then I was interested in exploring architecture more than, just when you're practicing it in the office building. So I went on to do my research masters in research architecture, specifically forensic architecture at the Goldsmiths College in London. And then I came back with some ideas in terms of how architecture can be used as a tool for transforming the way we think about our environments. And that's when I launched a project called Academy for Democracy. And through that, I started doing these visiting schools in different parts of the northern areas in Pakistan. And these schools were particularly looking at the intersections of climate, infrastructure, development and culture. And we were using architecture and built settlements to really understand how people are engaging with their landscapes. And from that on, I developed an interest in cultural geography, or I would say human geography. And then when I went on to doing my PhD in human geography from Durham University.
Would you like to explain a little bit about what do you mean by human geography?
Yes, so we're more sort of attuned to the understanding of geography as a physical science, but human geography particularly looks at how communities or how people interact with their geography or the built environment. So I was very interested in that, exploring that link. How do people connect to the landscapes? How are they affected by them? How do they shape them? And what are the politics or the dispositions behind that? So that is what human geography in a nutshell is.
And so what did you learn from your experience? What's the politics of environment, settlement, development, migrations, displacements, and human response? Their loss of culture, loss of history and all that.
Yes, I think that's a really long debate, but what I would like to say is that, the way that we interact with the geography is defined by the way that we're thinking about the world. And at the moment, I think there are two ways in which we're thinking about the world, and the one which is dominant is this very capitalistic, neoliberal way of understanding the world or operating in it. And this is primarily where our policies are coming from, or the way that states are governing their societies. But at the same time, we have these traditional societies or these, rural populations who have a very intimate connection with their environments. But that's also a very legitimate way of being in this world. And for me, it was more interesting to sort of explore that and also see how those marginal voices can be, explored and how they can be, given more strength.
Okay, that's very interesting. So you didn't work more with the play of spaces while drafting and maps of human settlements, habitats, but rather you connected it more with human experience.
Yes, exactly. And I would say that even in my bachelor's thesis, I was looking at hapticity and architecture. So how do you experience architecture, and what is that world of architecture? And so, you know, not really looking more towards the technological side of it, but really looking at the human side of it, and how do people sort of experience materials, or how do they feel a certain way in a particular environment, and what, you know, colors or textures or scale or volumes can sort of make you feel in a particular space.
So most of your work is in Himalaya and Hindu Kush region. How did you get interested in this region?
So
you had a love for mountains and trekking and
yes, exactly. I think it started off with my love for mountains, and we used to go there as children. We used to go in the mountains for our summer holidays. Our parents would take us. But then I also sort of visited when I was a student at the National College of Arts, and that's when I developed a keen interest in the vernacular architecture of the region. And that also sort of, that sort of brought me back to the region again and again through the visiting schools that we did. And I was more interested in looking at the connections between how the communities are using local materials to build with the terrain, and that was sort of fascinating for me. And that's what mainly took me to the mountains, and then I sort of stayed there because I then did my PhD on the resettlement of the IDPs from the Athabad disaster. So that's where I, just stayed there.
Yeah, I can remember Athabad disaster was, a turning point in the life and culture of those areas, because it had changed everything. The flow of the river, now it had been blocked, and a lake had emerged out of that. And I think I seen the places like Gulmeet and other places which was just submerged in the water. But before we come to that and what its effects people had to bear, what's the main features of their vernacular architecture you had found?
So I think when we look at the vernacular architecture, for me what really sort of stands out is their use of material and the techniques with which they build. And when you look in the Hindu Kush Himalaya mountain ranges or these areas, you see that, there's a very interesting way in which they have molded the material to make it fit for their built environment. And so the features, of course, they differ from place to place or from valley to valley in terms of the spatial patterns or in terms of the carvings that you might see. But what's really sort of what brings it together is their use of local materials and the way that they build on the land, understanding the land and climate, and then orienting their buildings accordingly.
As far as I remember, those local materials were mainly wood they had used.
So wood, stone and mud. So these three materials are there primarily. And if you look at regions such as Kailash, or if you look at the older buildings, you'll see that larger amount of wood has been used in those buildings. But of course now people are trying to sort of not use as much wood as they would previously, because there is a pressure on our forests as well. So what we're trying to do with the work that we're doing in the mountain areas is coming up with building typologies or designs or prototypes that use less amount of wood, but you can still build with local materials rather than completely shifting on cement concrete structures.
But I think also that is related to exposure to the modern world. Now there is influx of various investors and other things, and tourism, as you said, corporate tourism. So there is a lot of pressure on the local materials as well. But you can't stop it, because it will happen, because the roads are going there. There is a lot of traffic going over there. There is a lot of tourism that is going there. So how would you balance their environment, their local resources, and the design of the buildings they have, which require more consumption of materials around?
All right, so I think there are some misconceptions around, lack of availability of local materials. And the work that we've been doing in the last 10 years, I would say, and we've been mapping local materials, the supply of local materials, for example. So there is enough local materials to meet the demand that is required for the local built environment. But at the same time, I think we also need some policies and some limitations on the new materials that are coming in. And for that, we need, a legal framework in which we can really put a stop to the amount of, cement or concrete that is coming into these areas. And that is especially important because, these are not just any areas, these are very fragile ecological zones. And, worldwide we see that when you have such natural zones or fragile ecological zones, you have some bylaws or codes or laws that protect these areas. And that is something that is very much needed in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region because, we can't just say that the wildlife needs to be protected or the forest needs to be protected. I think even these cultural landscapes in which people are, deeply tied to the local kind of landscape, these areas also need to be protected, and we really have to look at the holistic protection and conservation of these areas, and that would include the city of Gilgit, for example, or a small town like Kaplu.
So such bylaws have been developed and they are in place?
I think the government is working on developing some master plans. Some master plans have already been developed. They have yet to be implemented. There is an absence of bylaws, I would say. We've worked on a project which was supported by the World Bank, and I was a consultant where I developed building bylaws and codes for Kailash Valley, especially because, we've seen a lot of influx of guest houses and hotels in the last couple of years. And to put a stop to that, we had to really protect the cultural and the built environment of Kailash Valley, and that could only be done by introducing bylaws. Those bylaws are still in the process of being approved by the cabinet, and I'm a member of the Kailash Valley development board as well, and we're hoping to see that these get implemented and we can put a stop to the horrendous buildings that are coming up in the name of tourism.
I have worked in that area, so I would just like to learn from you. There are a lot of challenges over there, particularly for Kailasha population, because there are very few in numbers, maybe in 3,500, something like that. And they are not part of any other mainstream faith group or religion. And they have very peculiar rituals and ways of living. Now, there are a lot of pressures on them because they don't have much representation in the governance structures of the government. And when, because there are not a lot of livelihood resources, they have to go down to the plains and work as bearers or something, some help in the house like that. So there is a lot of pressure of conversions as well, and because of corporate structures and systems, they don't want to go back and live in that hard conditions. What do you suggest that there can be a development of Kailasha people in which they can have exposure to development as well, and they can keep their identity intact as well? Like they are indigenous people, and there are a lot of internationally accepted conventions about in indigenous people, how can they survive, how can they keep their culture intact, and still they are offered the facilities of modern life as well.
I think that the Kailash case is, of course, a specific case, but I think that holds true for any sort of particular mountain community that we're talking about in Pakistan. And yes, they have, their specific rituals and festivals, but I would say that that's also true for a lot of other mountain communities who are very sort of tied to their local landscape, and they're still sort of carrying out their practices of pastoralism and their festivals, etc. So, and I think when I'm saying this for all the mountain communities that are grappling with two very different worldviews, where you have this dominant capitalist worldview of development, and then they have their own sort of worldview where they're intimately tied to their landscapes, and they're trying to hold on to those practices and trying to make sense of them in this increasingly globalized world. I think the onus is upon us as creative thinkers or as architects or as development practitioners, that we come up with policies that are context-based, that are grounded in the politics and issues of the context that we're dealing with, and those would have to be really sort of ground up rather than coming up with really sort of top-down approaches. And I would say that how we've tried to tackle this in the work that Lajvard has been doing is, setting up these community tea sessions, or talking to communities and really sort of taking them on board in every sort of thinking that we're doing with their environments. So I think it's not a thinking for that we need to do with these people, it's a thinking with that we're trying to sort of practice in the work that we do. And only then we can come up with strategies that would really make sense to those people and something that would be acceptable for them. With the Kailash building bylaws and codes, I would also like to point out that this was a process that was done very meticulously, keeping the Kailasha people on board, doing these participatory workshops where we were coming up with the building codes based on the issues that they were pointing out in the current kind of vernacular architectural system that they have. And this was a process that took about 6 months of intensive conversations with these people, and only then we were coming up with these drafts that were then again being checked by the local people. So it was that sort of a process, and it was a learning curve for us as well, and of course for the government as well, because we were then working with the Department of Archaeology and Tourism, and also very closely with the DC in Chitral.
You have just referred to your organization Lajvard, so I would like to hear more about your organization, and then we'll also discuss about all this process you have done with the local communities. What came out of that?
Yeah.
What emerged out of that? What kind of design should be made
right.
like that?
So Lajvard, a lot of people don't know what Lajvard means. So Lajvard is basically, yes, it's a stone, and it's a Persian name for lapis lazuli, and it's a blue stone that we find in the Hindu Kush mountains. And there's a beautiful story behind the stone.
Do you find it in the river streams as well?
I don't think so. It's found in the mountains, okay. And it took birth, they say, in the Badakhshan region, okay. And it's a very apt name for our organization, because that is the region where we are sort of based and we're working in. It's in the Hindu Kush Himalaya, and we're also working in the Central Asian region as well. Mm-hmm. And we've recently put up an exhibition. It's called The Echoes of the Silk Routes Between Mountains and Deserts at the Alliance Francaise, and that's talking about the cultures that we've been looking at and the sort of exchanges between the mountain cultures of these regions, and how silk routes, played an important role in propagating a particular kind of culture in these areas. So Lajvard is a research and design organization, so we are very sort of we're working in documenting cultural landscapes, engaging with these landscapes in a meaningful manner, and then also, we're interested in how we can, whatever we find out, how can we kind of disseminate it on a larger scale and get more people to think about these landscapes in the way that we do. So, be more empathetic to the environment, be more sort of sympathetic to the cultures. So that is primarily what Lajvard does, and it has recently set up a community conservation lab in Skardu, and through that lab we are working with local masons, carpenters, weavers, makers in the mountain regions to sort of train ourselves in the practices of conservation.
So while you are working with them, what value addition they have done to the design and other things, and what you have added into their already existing design?
So I would say that we're more sort of interested in looking at the practices and techniques of building and maintaining buildings, and for that we've also sort of developed a book. It's called mountain architecture, building and conservation in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region. And this book basically, talks about all the research that we have done, and it's sort of suggesting these prototypes for different parts of the mountain regions. And then it has a section on how do you maintain vernacular structures. So, just don't knock them down. It's about maintaining structures and how are you living and growing with the buildings. And the very good part about these vernacular buildings is that, these are all also very living structures. You've used, local materials in them, and these buildings are like living, breathing structures as we like to see them. So what we've learned from, I would say that, maybe they haven't learned anything from us. We've learned a lot from the local masters, and really seen how they look at materials. And what really stood out for me in the work that I was doing was how they sort of what is their temporality of dealing with the landscape, and what is their temporality of building these structures, because in the cities we're in a race, and we want our structures to come up as soon as possible, etc. We want the material to be ready, we can't wait. But in the mountain areas, you have to sort of attune yourself to the temporality of the climate, the seasons, and everything is sort of based on the seasons. And in that sense, we are very sort of connected to the natural environment. And I really sort of like that. And I learned that patience when I was working in the mountain areas.
Good. There's also another very important question. It's a question of conservation and how to deal with the change. Like you have discussed a lot about Kalasha culture and their built environment. It's very good to have a conservation of that culture. There are certain rituals over there, like bhashalinis, in which women are just segregated from rest of the society in certain times. It's their culture, but do you think you may advise them, or you may suggest them some kind of structures which are comfortable for those women in those times when they are separated from rest of the communities?
I think at the moment the structures that they have for the bashalinis are quite well equipped, and they're nice. Most of the ones that I have seen. And although yes, the women are segregated, but I see that they really enjoy the ones that I've spoken to. I will not say that I'm speaking for everybody, that they enjoy this segregation. Okay. And they get time to themselves, to rest, to bond with the other women, and they actually sort of like it. And the structures, I would say, are also well equipped. There was a Greek organization that actually built most of the bashalinis in most of the villages in Bamburat, at least.
Here I would also like to hear from you the concerns of architecture and culture and conflicts because of various reasons you might have come across. It may be due to displacements, it may be due to some investors who want to make some good hotels, guest houses for attracting tourists. So how do you deal with these things in terms of keeping it sustainable, friendly with the local population, and also providing them more facilities?
I think it sort of depends, and because I also teach architecture, I used to teach architecture, and I still do sometimes as a visiting studio instructor. I think it really depends on the architect's sort of moral code that they need to abide by, and for that it does become hard, but you need to have persuasion skills in order to really sort of put your point across to your clients or to the community, and when we're working with the environment, we really have to, as I would say, on moral grounds, really put the environment first, or nature first, and then sort of see how our intervention is going to have an impact on the communities, on the environment, on the culture. I mean, this might come off as a naive sort of point, but I think that is at the core of everything. You will go to an extent, or you will take certain decisions based on what you believe in. And if you believe that it's okay to kind of, ravage the landscape and the nature, then you'll probably go ahead with a particular kind of building typology. But if you're more sort of sensitive towards the environment and nature, then you're going to be very careful in the decisions that you make. And I think as an architect, we have a lot of responsibility, and that's not just sort of based on design, but also, on the choice of our materials, on the way that people are going to experience those buildings, and also the kind of culture that building might introduce in that area. So, if we're making a building which is not environmentally responsible, we might just give way to a lot of other people to see that and start building in that way. So I think we have a lot of responsibility, and we have to be very we have to start being conscious of that responsibility.
But can we just leave it to the individual moral approach of an architect? It has to be maybe converted into bylaws and strictly
yes.
to be
yes, I think
implemented and monitored as well.
Absolutely. So I think on the first, like when you spoke about design, that's when I thought that I should talk about the moral responsibility of the architect. But of course, there's a whole ecosystem that needs to come in place in order to make sure that we are protecting our environments and we are conserving them. And for that, policies, bylaws, codes, they are required. But then, just making them on paper is not enough. You really need to sort of have a dialogue with the communities or the population or the investors, that why are these needed and how they have to be sort of implemented. And then you need a whole monitoring structure or the monitoring system in place that makes sure that these guidelines are followed.
And I think there should be an exclusive area of studies like architecture in fragile ecologies, which should be a specialized field, and students should be trained in that.
Absolutely, I agree. I think at the moment in Pakistan, we just have a bachelor's in architecture design or a bachelor's in architectural engineering. And then, students in their 5th year of which is their thesis year or the final year, that's when they sort of pick up projects where they look specifically at, these sorts of relations with architecture. But as a subject, you're absolutely right. It should be taught, and we do have ecological environments or environmental systems as a subject or sustainable systems as a subject. But I think it just remains as a subject. The moment students enter the market, the market is, as we're all aware, full of, real estate and the kind of buildings that are required for the architects to build, and they just sort of get swayed away in the market.
You have also worked on a project related to gender mainstreaming in architecture.
Yes, that's basically, it's not a project, it's an initiative. It's called Women in Architecture, Pakistan.
Okay.
And there was a group of women who started this initiative, and I'm one of the board members there, and I'm the head of initiatives there. And we've basically been looking at how women can, what is the women's role in architecture in Pakistan, and how can we strengthen that role, and how can we really sort of acknowledge and understand that role.
But I think there is also a need to mainstream gender concerns in architecture, because for example, in the houses what we made, we may just exclude women. Kitchen is somewhere very in a far off area. And now it has been brought closer to the lounge and where people sit, because she is not just excluded from others while she's working, but she's interacting with them.
Yeah.
So same could be possibly a concern in mountainous areas as well, because
I think you've raised a very important point, and this was something that I worked on in my PhD thesis, because I was looking at the structures that the AKPBS designed for the internally displaced people from the Atabad disaster. And this was happening in the Noor, and I went on to see those structures, and the design was something that was not acceptable to the local people because, they had made like a modern house, they had made a separate kitchen. And in the houses in Hunza or Gojal, you can see that the kitchen is the heart of the house.
Yeah.
It's right in the center.
It's
And that's when,
always,
exactly. And that's where, the women are, and where they gather, where they listen to what's happening in the house the whole day. So, they're really at the heart of the house. And when you go and you design and build a resettlement structure, you're just sort of segregating the woman in a separate kitchen. So I really don't know where these ideas come from and who is designing these structures. But this was an easy one to understand, that when you're designing for people who have a very specific sort of an architecture, and you see that pattern replicating in all of their vernacular settlements, I mean, it's easy to pick up on that. And I don't know what happens in our developmental structures or in the way that we are responding to emergencies or disasters, that we completely forget the cultural landscape.
I also visited some the houses which were built after the Sataba disaster. I think they were quite friendly with their local environment. They had a central point which was serving as a kitchen as well.
Yeah.
But it was also serving as a producing heat as well.
Exactly.
Around everywhere. So very friendly structure it was.
Exactly.
Yeah. And there's also something you have worked on, Islamic architecture.
I think I wouldn't say it's Islamic architecture. We were working on in the northern areas, so particularly in Baltistan. And we were looking at the heritage assets within the vernacular buildings, so such as Khatamband or Pinjrakari. And then we were looking at the roots of these art forms that exist in the vernacular architecture of the khanqahs or the mosques. And that's when we sort of started looking at the links of, Islam and architecture in these areas. And we had this Sayyid Mir Ali Hamdani, who came from Hamadan, Iran, through Central Asia into Kashmir. And he brought, they say, something like 700 skilled persons with him. And then that's when, the cultures of Kashmir and Persia were sort of interacting and amalgamating with each other. And the fruits of those are seen in these arts of Pinjrakari and Khatamband that we find in Baltistan at the moment. So we were just looking at the essence, the character, and the materiality of these built forms, and that's where Islam sort of emerged as a very central, the Islamic cosmology emerged as a very central point at which these art forms are designed and around which they are organized.
So human geography is also your subject, and architecture is also your subject, and so much more I was seeing you have studied and got certificates. So how do you think, particularly in these mountainous areas, like the problems of displacement, conflict, migration in built environment, and how it should be addressed?
I think I would return to the point of really listening to the people and understanding the terrain and landscapes. So whatever solution that we're coming up with, or whatever strategy or approach we're coming up with, it has to be aligned with the cultural landscape of the community. So what are their practices, what are their dispositions, and keeping that at the center of our designing or planning or policies. So I think that is really at the heart of it, and this is something that we have been experimenting with. This is something that we have sort of adopted in the way that we work with mountain communities, and it has been fruitful. So the interventions that are in line with the cultural landscapes or the cultural dispositions of local communities, those are the ones that are successful. And the ones that are very top down and they have not really thought about the landscape or the people, those are the ones that fail. And we see that in a lot of sort of vocational institutes, or we see that not institutes, but weaving centers, for example, that you set them up and then the project is gone and then these are just empty buildings waiting for their fate. So, yeah.
That is what you mean, the community-based conservation you are working on.
Yes, so recently since last year we've been working on a project called Community-Based Conservation of Silk Route Heritages, and this has been happening through our Community Conservation Lab that we set up in Skardu. And through this lab we have been working with mountain communities, trying to understand their cultural assets, their associations and attachments with these, and then also sort of documenting their techniques of conservation. And in that, we've really been working with the memory of old people like dadas and dadis, and sitting with them, trying to understand how would you plaster your roof, how would you make sure that the water doesn't come in, or how would they do certain things, how would you make sure the wood doesn't rot quickly. And those things are in their memories. It's just giving time to it and really sort of helping them recall those and then documenting those and then using those, because they have stood the test of time and we have a lot to learn from that.
Could you just tell us a few monuments or buildings or something related to architecture which is preserved here or which needs to be preserved on the Silk Route or Himalaya, Hindu Kush region?
Yeah, so I think the Aga Khan Cultural Services Program has done a tremendous job in the cultural preservation of these landscapes, and I think they've taken a very holistic view to these landscapes, because they've also looked at the development of local people and at the same time the protection of the cultural heritage. I think what we're sort of doing in that regard is also working with the techniques and also sort of documenting those and preserving those, so that an organization or a consultant doesn't always have to come in to do it. The communities should be equipped to do it, and that is particularly what the Community Conservation Lab is trying to do. In terms of artifacts or monuments that still need conservation, there are many. In Gilgit-Baltistan, we'll see that most of these monuments are privately owned buildings. They are either palaces or they're forts, and the family owns them, but they don't have the means to protect them. Most of the funding that comes in is, cannot be spent on private properties, and that is where the challenge is. What really helped us with the Cultural Protection Fund of the British Council that was launched in Pakistan last year, and we were one of the recipients of this grant, was that we could work on privately owned buildings, and that really gave us the way to connect with communities, get them on board, make them aware, and then work with them in conserving these structures. And we worked with all the local masonry and carpentry teams, and it was amazing. So I think we really also need to sort of think about this private public ownership, and at the end of the day, let people be the custodians of their heritage, rather than taking over and cordoning off and sanitizing heritage for the tourists only.
I saw a museum in, I think, Bomboret, which was made by a Greek volunteer.
Yeah.
It was amazing. I mean, a person who came from Greece, and he generated funds and collected funds and made all these things, just a personal initiative.
Yes.
Why can't local people do that? Like local people means, people from Pakistan, they can have understanding how important this thing is, and they should have made some museum.
Yeah, absolutely, they should have, and I think some initiatives have been taken by local communities, and I've been fortunate enough to be part of 2 museums that are led by the communities themselves. One was in Janvai in Neelam Valley, Upper Neelam Valley, and it was an initiative by a local person who had been collecting all these items for a very long time. And when I was there doing the visiting school, he asked me to sort of come and do up his little showroom. And that was a chance for me to step into this terrain and actually work with them and train them in archiving and, curating their museum in a way that the people understand what they want to sort of narrate in terms of their landscape and culture. And then the AKRSP and the Swiss Development Fund They asked us to do a museum in Laspur, and we built that in using local materials. It's a very peculiar sort of a design inspired from the traditional pattern of housing there, and that's called the Heritage Museum Laspur. So whenever you're there next, you should visit it.
And you have contributed in making museum policies of Pakistan as well.
Yes, so that was an initiative which was taken by MAP, which is an organization, Museums of Pakistan organization, and Museums Association of Pakistan, sorry. And you know, it was they asked me that if I can make these policies, and then I, you know, sort of got down to that, and I made a very comprehensive document on museums policies for Pakistan. But they have not been implemented, or nothing has happened around that. But I think it's a very it's a comprehensive document, and there is much that we can learn from and apply in the museums all across Pakistan.
And you have made architecture policy for Kailash Valley as well.
Yes, so these are building bylaws and codes for the Kailash Valley. But before that, based on the research that we had been doing in the mountains, I came up with the Mountain Architecture Guidelines for Sustainable Tourism Development. So this is the book, and this was mainly the inspiration on which the bylaws were designed.
Okay. So most of your contribution is towards mountainous regions, but there are other fragile ecologies as well, like coastal regions.
Absolutely.
Riverine belts, and so how about that? You have some plans to work on that as well?
Not as yet. I think I wouldn't want to step into other terrains as yet, because there is a lot that still needs to be done in the mountains. And I think there are other practitioners who are doing brilliant work in these areas. Mm-hmm. And I think the local ecology, and understanding the local ecology and these local systems, it takes I say it takes decades to do that. And moving places would probably not help as much. So I'd like to just stay here.
Okay. So you have worked only in this area out of Pakistan as well?
Yes.
Where?
So we did a similar sort of an exercise that we do with the visiting school in Tajikistan, in the Gorno-Badakhshan Autonomous Region, and in the Alai-Chunalai region in Kyrgyzstan. And now I'm also working in Uzbekistan as well. And the concerns are similar. We set up a resilient Silk Route heritage network in Pakistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and we're looking at local mountain communities and how they're interacting with the new infrastructural developments, especially the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative, and we're looking at the local cultures or the local sort of practices in that, and how they are being affected by large infrastructural development. And in Uzbekistan, we're working specifically on fragile heritage ecologies. We developed this framework for mapping fragile heritages, and we trained local communities in mapping their own heritages and assessing risks to their heritage. And now we got some support and funding by the UK government to take this project to Uzbekistan and train the people there. So we're doing that now.
So any differences you found in your experiences working outside Pakistan, like all these countries you have just mentioned?
Yes, I think what really connects all these regions is their shared heritage, and so for me it's been really easy to navigate these landscapes, because there is so much similarity in how these cultures or societies are organized that it didn't feel foreign at all. And of course, there is the language barrier. But I think with culture and practices, even that doesn't make a lot of difference anymore.
Do you think your initiatives, if they are not supported by the government and very strong policy of government to support these sustainability issues, you would be able to make a difference without that?
I think that's a very interesting question, and something that we ask ourselves all the time. I think government support and patronage is definitely required if this needs to happen on a scale where it can really make a difference. And And without that, it's very difficult, because of course you have this state functioning in these regions, you know, functioning in whatever way they're functioning. But you know, that sort of a support system is really sort of required, and without that we can't scale up. And I think it's only the government that can really sort of scale up. But I would say here that we still have another sort of inspiration, and that comes from the work that Sultan Saab were doing with the AKRSP when they set up the farm forestry projects all across these mountain areas, and that was based on a community network system. And I think I find a lot of I think I see strength in that, and if we can develop that, then you know, there is an alternative to where the state is not functioning as it should. These networks really sort of hold up and hold on, so that could really work.
What are the trends these days? Are people accepting the changes you are advising? What do you think future of this area?
I think when we talk to people and the work that we are doing, people do agree, because you know, we are really on the ground talking to elders, talking to people, and we just sort of, and they come up to us and they tell us that, you know, they used to have a traditional house that was built in traditional materials, and it was, you know, warm in winters and, you know, cool in summers. But when they made a house out of cement and concrete that came from the down areas, as they call it, you know, their houses are cold in winters and they're boiling in summers. So they understand the value of their cultural practices, they understand the value of their vernacular architecture, and now they say that, you know, if we have a chance to build again, we're going to use local materials and do that. So what we're trying to be working on in terms of the prototypes is that, you know, how can we come up with designs that are in local materials but using, you know, exerting less pressure on forests, so using less wood, and so going into, you know, frame structures and sort of where the infill is all with local materials that can withstand the extreme temperatures in these areas.
What are your future projects?
So I think with our future projects, we want to, you know, sort of focus more on these community conservation labs that we've set up, and we'll be working across these regions and just continuing the work that we are doing. And if anything interesting comes up, then we'll of course dive into it. Our work has always been very organic, and you know, it has taken us to very interesting places, and we thank God for that.
You're enjoying your work.
Absolutely.
That's the best thing one can have.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you, Dr. Zahra, for being with us this evening. It was wonderful talking to you.
Thank you.
So viewers, thank you for watching us. See you next Sunday, same time.